Somewhere in a climate-controlled storage facility outside Denver, there's a shelf. On that shelf sits a box. And inside that box is a sample so small most people would never notice it existed at all. Yet in January of 1984, it already knew something no detective, no profiler, no police department in 2 states could figure out. It knew a name. It would take 34 years for anyone to ask it the right question. That's the strange, uncomfortable truth at the center of this case. The answer wasn't missing. It wasn't hidden by some criminal mastermind covering his tracks. It was sitting in a labeled container under fluorescent light, wading through decades of parole hearings, dating profiles, and prison transfers. It didn't need to believe in justice to eventually deliver it. It just needed the world to catch up. This is the story of a family destroyed in one night, and a piece of evidence that spent 34 years trying to finish a sentence it started the moment everything went wrong. The Bennetts weren't the kind of family anyone worried about. Bruce, 27, a Navy veteran studying to become an air traffic controller. Deborah, 26, who'd spent her own childhood raising her younger siblings and finally, in this house on this street, got to just be someone's wife instead of everyone's caretaker. Melissa, 7 days from her real birthday, already celebrating with cake and a new organ she played loudly and badly and joyfully. And Vanessa, 3, asleep down the hall in the particular, unguarded way only small children sleep. The kind of sleep that assumes the world is safe because so far it always has been. That Sunday night, family filled the house. Laughter. Coats going on as the evening wound down. And on the way out, one small detail, the garage door still open to the cold. Someone mentioned it. Bruce nodded. Then the warmth of the house pulled him back inside to tuck his daughters in, and the door stayed open one night too many. By morning, 3 of the Bennetts were dead and the 4th, 3 years old, was barely alive, found in the narrow gap between 2 beds by a firefighter who almost walked past her. What happened in that house was fast, brutal, and, investigators would later understand, disturbingly practiced. A hammer brought in and carried back out. A kitchen knife taken from the Bennett's own set. Bloody boot prints moving room to room with no hesitation, no panic, no wasted motion. This wasn't rage. This was routine. And when it was over, the man responsible walked back out through that same garage door into the snow, and disappeared completely. No name, no face, nothing that would mean anything to anyone for over 3 decades. Almost nothing. Because he left something behind he couldn't take back. Investigators moved through the Bennett house that morning collecting anything that might one day matter. Boot prints preserved from the carpet. A hammer recovered outside in the snow. A knife pulled from where it had been discarded. And in the girl's bedroom, something smaller, something that wouldn't mean anything for another 17 years. A biological sample, carefully swabbed from the carpet beneath Melissa's body, and a comforter from one of the twin beds, folded and logged into evidence. At the time, nobody could have called this the most important piece of the case. It didn't have fingerprints. It didn't have a face. It couldn't be shown to a witness or run through a database that didn't exist yet. In 1984, forensic science could do exactly one thing with it: determine a blood type. That was the entire vocabulary available. A handful of letters that narrowed the suspect pool from everyone on Earth to several million people. Useful to no one. Not yet. But something happened in that collection process that mattered more than anyone in that house realized. The killer had left a piece of himself behind. Not a memory, not a description. Not something a traumatized survivor would need to reconstruct from a fog of fear. Something exact. Something that didn't degrade with time the way human memory does. That didn't get confused by decades or worn down by grief. Something that would still be telling the truth in 2018 exactly as precisely as it had been in 1984. That's the handoff. That's the moment the story stops belonging only to the people in that house and starts belonging, in part, to the sample sitting in evidence. From here forward, there are 2 timelines running in parallel. The human one, Connie driving to that house, Vanessa fighting for her life in a hospital bed, a city checking its locks twice a night, and a quieter one, unfolding inside labs and storage units and mailing envelopes, where a piece of evidence sealed in 1984 is simply waiting for the world to build a language it can finally speak. It would take 5 years before anyone even remembered the comforter existed. 6 more before a test built to reveal the truth would accidentally destroy the only sample capable of telling it. And 17 years before science could give this evidence a full sentence instead of a single fragmented word. The killer thought he'd left the house with everything that mattered and nothing that could hurt him. He was wrong twice. He'd left 3 people dead and he'd left the one witness who would never stop testifying. Before we go further into what this evidence had to survive, it's worth saying, every case we cover on this channel takes weeks of research. Court records, case files, forensic reports, cross-referencing timelines across multiple jurisdictions to get the details right. If that kind of care matters to you, consider subscribing and drop a comment letting us know what part of this story is sitting with you so far. Now back to the evidence. When the sample from the Bennett house reached the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, it gave investigators everything it could. Which, in January of 1984, wasn't much. A blood type. That was the full extent of what forensic science could extract from biological evidence at the time. One data point shared by roughly a third of the population. Not a name. Not a face. Not even a meaningful narrowing of suspects. The sample had the answer sitting inside it, encoded, complete, unambiguous. It just didn't have anyone yet who spoke its language. So it was sealed, labeled, placed in storage with the quiet, procedural hope that someday, someone would build the tools to read what it already knew. Nobody working that case in 1984 could have imagined what that would eventually require. Not a better microscope, not a sharper detective, but an entirely new branch of science that hadn't been invented yet. DNA profiling was still years from existing in any usable form. The sample wasn't just waiting for a lead. It was waiting for an entire field to catch up to it. It would take 17 years before this evidence could speak in a full sentence instead of a single fragmented word. 17 years of sitting in a box while the case around it went cold, while a family kept grieving, while a killer kept moving. The truth didn't change during any of that time. It just had no way to get out. What almost nobody investigating the Bennett murders knew in January of 1984 was that this wasn't an isolated sample. It wasn't a single signature in a single evidence room. It was a pattern, the same handwriting, so to speak, showing up in property rooms across 2 different counties, collected by 2 different departments, and there was no shared system on Earth capable of noticing. 12 days before the Bennetts were killed, James and Kimberly Habenchild survived a hammer attack in their own bedroom in Aurora. Evidence collected. Filed. 5 days later, in Lakewood, Patricia Smith didn't survive hers. A hammer left at the scene, a body covered deliberately with a child's blanket, evidence collected, filed under an entirely separate case number in an entirely separate jurisdiction. That same evening, 25 miles away, Donna Dixon survived an attack that erased the one piece of evidence no lab could ever preserve, her memory of the attacker's face. More evidence, more filing cabinets, more silence between departments that had no reason to think they were looking at pieces of the same puzzle. 4 attacks. 2 counties. The same weapon pattern, the same method of entry, the same signature written into evidence rooms that had absolutely no way of talking to each other. This is the part of the story that isn't about a killer outsmarting anyone. It's about evidence that was, in a very real sense, already solving the case in 1984, already matching itself sample to sample, if only there had been a system built to let it. There wasn't. Not yet. So 4 separate case files sat in 4 separate places, each one holding a fragment of the same truth, none of them able to reach across the room and complete the sentence the others were trying to say. The attacks in Colorado stopped as abruptly as they'd started, and for a moment, it looked like relief. No more calls in the night. No more evidence rooms filling up with the same signature. It should have felt like an ending. It wasn't. It was a pause, the kind that happens right before a story shifts location entirely. 200 miles south, in a small Arizona town called Kingman, a man's shoe was about to leave a print in the snow outside someone else's house. And this time, for the first time since this had all begun, someone would actually be watching. Roy Williams woke up to pain he didn't have time to understand. A stranger stood over him in the dark, using something heavy and blunt, something picked up rather than brought, raw, close-range, personal in a way the Colorado attacks hadn't quite been. And then Roy did something none of the previous victims had been able to do. He spoke. "Why are you doing this?" Something in the question stopped the attacker cold. He stood there a moment, then simply walked out. Roy survived. 100 stitches, broken ribs, but conscious, and critically, awake enough to describe what he'd seen. Hours later, a patrol officer noticed a disheveled man near a truck stop, thumb out on the interstate, a quarter mile from Roy's house. Routine questions. Then a request to see his shoes. The tread matched impressions left at the scene. The man ran. Officers found him behind a bush, out of breath, out of options. His name was Alex Christopher Ewing, 23 years old. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's the contrast that makes everything else in this story so hard to accept. A living witness and a shoe print did in a matter of hours what DNA sitting in a Colorado evidence locker couldn't do in years. This wasn't evidence that failed. This was evidence that worked exactly the way evidence is supposed to work. Fast, direct, conclusive. It just happened to belong to a different case in a different state built on a different kind of proof. Which meant that in 1984, the tools existed to catch Alex Ewing. They simply weren't the tools that were watching the right door. Ewing was in custody, awaiting trial, when a routine prisoner transfer stopped to refuel in Henderson, Nevada. He walked out of a gas station restroom and kept walking, into a residential neighborhood, into the home of Nancy and Chris Berry, where he left Chris with permanent brain damage and Nancy alive only because she went still and gave him nothing to fight. For 4 days he moved through the Nevada desert with no money and no food, until a wiretapped phone call led rangers to him at a payphone near Lake Mead. 2 hours of trial. Guilty on all counts. 110 years, the maximum Nevada allowed, and as far as Colorado's evidence room was concerned, the last anyone would hear of Alex Ewing for over 3 decades. While Ewing disappeared into a Nevada correctional facility, the evidence back in Colorado began a different kind of sentence. One measured not in years behind bars, but in years behind a lab door, waiting for someone to ask it the right question. 1984. The sample is sealed with a single answer, a blood type. Not a name, not a lead, just a fact too broad to be useful. It goes into storage with no expiration date on the hope attached to it. 1989. An investigator reviewing the file makes a discovery that should never have needed making. The comforter from the girl's bedroom, one of the most direct pieces of evidence from the scene, was never actually sent to the crime lab. Not overlooked in the science. Overlooked before the science ever had a chance to begin. 5 years, sitting 2 miles from where Vanessa Bennett was relearning how to walk, untested, unremembered. Corrected immediately once found, and then submitted, and then made to wait again. The results wouldn't come back for another year, and when they did, a partial profile. Not enough. 1990. Somewhere else in the file, something smaller surfaces. A microscopic sample, easy to miss, potentially the clearest link to an identity the case had. It's sent for specialized testing with the kind of careful optimism that only exists when there's almost nothing left to lose. The test does exactly what it was built to do, extract the truth. And in doing so, it consumes the only sample capable of holding it. No result. No profile. The evidence's closest brush with speaking, and its most complete silence, arrive in the same moment. 1999 to 2001. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation returns to what's left, this time with tools that didn't exist 15 years earlier. 2 years of careful, patient work. And finally, a full DNA profile. Not a blood type. Not a fragment. A complete genetic fingerprint, precise enough to isolate one person out of 18 million. For the first time since January of 1984, the evidence could finally speak in a full sentence. It said everything except the one thing anyone needed to hear. Investigators ran the profile through CODIS, the national database built from convicted offenders across the country, and the search came back empty. The profile was flawless. It simply had no name attached to it anywhere in the system, because the man it belonged to was sitting in a Nevada prison cell, filling out parole paperwork, and nobody had ever thought to ask Nevada for a sample. The key had finally been cut. There was still no lock to put it in. In 2016, the sample spoke again, and for the first time it wasn't just talking to itself. Run back through CODIS on a routine check, the profile from the Bennett house returned a match, not to a name yet, but to another case entirely, Patricia Smith. 2 crime scenes, 2 counties, 1 signature, finally standing next to each other after 32 years apart. Then came the irony that would close this case out. Nevada passed a law requiring every inmate to submit DNA for the national database. No enforcement deadline attached. Just paperwork, moving at the speed paperwork moves when nobody's watching the clock. Ewing's sample sat in the backlog for 2 years while he built a parole case, while he set up a dating profile, while he genuinely believed the finish line was close. 1 week after his DNA finally entered the system, CODIS returned a match. Perfect. Undeniable. 34 years after it was collected, the evidence had finally found the one thing it never had, a name to attach itself to. 2 detectives flew to Nevada without identifying why. Ewing talked freely, placed himself in Aurora, in Lakewood, doing construction in the exact neighborhoods where 4 people had been attacked in 12 days. Then came the photograph, Patricia Smith, alive, ordinary, someone's mother. He said he didn't know her. Then came the second photograph, the one from the crime scene, the Winnie the Pooh blanket laid over a woman who'd only wanted to help her daughter settle into a new home. Something behind Ewing's eyes shifted. He asked for a lawyer. A court-ordered swab confirmed what the sample had known since before he was old enough to understand what he'd become. His DNA and the DNA from that carpet, that living room, were the same. For 34 years, state lines had done more to protect Alex Ewing than he had ever done to protect himself. A crime in Colorado. A capture in Arizona. A sentence in Nevada. 3 separate systems, 3 separate sets of paperwork, 3 separate reasons nobody ever had to connect the dots. And he had lived inside that gap quietly, invisibly for over 3 decades. When Colorado filed for extradition, his legal team reached for the only tool that had ever worked for him. Appeal after appeal, arguing the transfer was unconstitutional, that the DNA evidence crossing state lines couldn't be trusted, that the very borders which had sheltered him for 34 years should shelter him one more time. 16 months of motions. 16 months of a man throwing the last thing he had left against walls that had finally stopped moving. The Nevada Supreme Court rejected every argument. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear it at all. In August of 2020, Alex Ewing was flown back to Colorado in handcuffs, landing in the same cold, same snow, same flat eastern edge of Denver where this had all begun. The lines on the map that had made him someone else's problem for 34 years had just run out of places left to send him. The trial began in July of 2021, 37 years after a birthday party, a garage door, a family that never got to see what came next. The prosecution laid out decades of evidence, piece by piece, until the picture it formed was impossible to look away from. And then Vanessa Bennett stood up. 40 years old now, the 3-year-old girl found in the gap between 2 beds, the one doctors had called a miracle. She looked at the man who had taken her family and spoke plainly, without performance. I lost the person I was supposed to be. I lost my sanity. I look in the mirror every day and I hate who I am. I hate what I had to go through and still go through. She told the courtroom about the addiction that swallowed her teenage years, the son she lost custody of, the suicide attempt, the years of homelessness that felt like they would never end, and then about the decision at 30 to stop being destroyed by a night she couldn't even remember. Rehab. Recovery. Reconnecting with her son. A partner. A voice she chose to use publicly, not for sympathy, but because she understood her story might keep someone else alive. The jury deliberated 9 hours. Guilty on all 3 counts. The judge called it an abomination and handed down 3 consecutive life sentences, no possibility of parole. The exact freedom Ewing had spent months quietly preparing for, gone completely. Asked if he had anything to say, he offered 2 words. No, thank you. A year later, a second jury convicted him for Patricia Smith's murder. A 4th life sentence. Connie Bennett, who had driven to that house on a Monday morning in 1984 because something told her to, stood outside the courthouse afterward and was asked if she finally had closure. She thought about it. It's not closure, she said. But we've learned to live with it. This was never really the story of one man slipping quietly through the cracks. It was the story of an entire country full of them. Evidence rooms that couldn't talk to each other, databases with no one in them yet, laws with no deadlines attached, states that had no reason to think they were holding pieces of the same puzzle. Alex Ewing didn't outsmart the system. He simply knew, better than almost anyone, how to stand in the space between one jurisdiction and the next and wait. The sample that sat in that Colorado storage room for 34 years never once stopped telling the truth. It just took the world that long to ask it the right question, in the right state, at the right time. So here's what's worth sitting with. How many other cases are doing exactly what this one did? Sitting solved, sitting silent, sitting unmatched across a line on a map right now? If a piece of evidence can wait 3 decades and still be right, what does that say about the ones we haven't asked yet? And if the thing that finally caught him wasn't a detective's instinct but a law nobody enforced for 2 years, how much of justice, in the end, comes down to paperwork nobody thought was urgent? If this case left you thinking about how close the truth came to staying buried forever, that's exactly why we do what we do here. Every case we cover takes weeks of digging, court records, forensic reports, cross-referencing timelines most people never see, because these families deserve more than a headline, they deserve the whole story told right. If you want to see justice like this actually get its due, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment and tell us, what part of this case is going to stay with you tonight? And if you know someone who needs a reminder that some truths don't expire, that patience and persistence eventually catch up to even the most careful killer, send this their way. We'll see you in the next case.